I will now pass over to Tim and to Shaun, and I hope you all enjoy the evening and what Tim and Shaun have to share. Tim, are you there?
I am there. Thank you, Tim. Can you see me? Can you hear me? I hope so. Yep.
Yes,
great.
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Well, welcome. Thanks, Tim, first of all, and thanks to Emma and Gil on the tasting team. And welcome to everybody who's joining us. A very good turnout tonight. So obviously there's a bit of interest in Bordeaux 2019, which is great. Also, welcome to Shaun. Shaun Kiernan is our fine wine manager. Shaun is actually officially on holiday this week. So he's made the huge sacrifice of joining us tonight with a presumably a large glass of something very nice. What are you drinking, Shaun?
Thank you very much, Tim. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I'm actually drinking Chateau Contamel 2005.
And how is it?
So it's, as Sebastian described it in his original note, because I looked it up earlier, it's sweet and with Contamel's usual charm, and it is absolutely delicious, I have to say. It's 2005, which was a fantastic year.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget Sebastian saying that actually he was so glad to be alive to taste that vintage. And it was an absolutely stunning vintage. And I waited a long time for this to come round. And the drink date, I think, is the end is 2022. So, but I think it'll go on. Actually, it's got lots of stuffing and lots of, as Sebastian says, charm and sweetness. So it's lovely. I opened it about 2 hours ago, and it really is just coming together nicely. So I'm looking forward to the whole case. And I think I've got Hauteville and Angleday in the same mixed case. So, so what have you got, Tim?
So I've got Lacoste Bory 2015. So that's the second wine of Grand Prix Lacoste, Pauillac. Delicious, absolutely benchmarks Pauillac. It's the 15 is a good vintage, and it's actually quite forward because being the second wine, it's got a higher Merlot content and is ready for drinking sooner, but it's very Pauillac, and it's absolutely delicious. And I chilled it slightly in the fridge so that it's the right temperature. Yeah, and it's terrific.
That's interesting.
Anyway, let's get started on 2019 Bordeaux.
Yeah, so your visits last year, Tim.
Yes. So last year, most years I try and do at least one visit during harvest. I don't think many merchants do that, but because we have relative liberty to choose when we travel, I've always believed that it's good to see the grapes coming in, because you do get an awful lot of, shall we say, BS talked about with people bigging up the vintage, saying, oh, well, it was very sunny throughout harvest. But if you're there, then you know whether it was sunny during harvest or whether it actually was raining in certain parts. So it's actually a very useful way of assessing, giving just an initial assessment of the vintage. So I went in the third week of September on the right bank to taste the Merlots effectively. So I was particularly Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. I attended an event in Saint-Emilion, and I think we've got one or two picks from when I was in Saint-Emilion. Yes, I visited Lassis Ducasse, amongst others. That's their vineyard, and various chateaux. So that picture is. I was staying at Canon, and that's a view from Canon looking towards the church in Saint-Emilion. But that was the day when actually the heavens started to open. It had been very nice, hot, sunny weather. And then that was a Sunday. Yeah, so that was the day before, the Saturday. And then the Sunday, it started to rain. But that's up on the plateau where the best vineyards are.
So Tim, I mean, that's something I'd love to do. All my years working at the Wine Society, I've never been to Bordeaux and done a harvest. I've always gone and tasted from barrel in April or whatever. So it's something that actually I'd love to go and do.
It's well worth doing. So of course the Merlots ripen earlier than the Cabernets. So I did about 4 days, I think it was, around the third week of September, 20th to the 23rd or something it was, if I remember rightly. And the Merlot grapes were about halfway through the harvest, but they were looking very promising. And then I went back 2 weeks later, I think it was the second week in October. I took Steve Finlan, our chief executive, with me because he hadn't done a trip with the Wine Society, and I felt it was important for him to actually meet some growers. So we were out on the left bank visiting Margaux. We visited Angleday. We visited Pichon-Baron. We went to Domaine de Chevalier. We went to Aubaye. So we had a good trip, and we saw grapes coming in there. That picture there that's just been posted is some Merlot grapes being sorted at Angleday. So you can see there isn't much rubbish in there. They're not picking out a huge amount of unripe grapes or twigs or anything. They've they've got a nice, healthy-looking harvest. There you go. There's some Merlot grapes once they've been de-stemmed, and they look terrific. So small berries, which is always a good sign because that gives colour and tannin. And if you have a small proportion of liquid or juice to pulp and skins, you get wines that have quite a lot of structure and capacity to age. So that's a good sign.
I bet Angleday were pleased, Tim, that for the 19 vintage after 18 and 17, because they didn't make any, or they struggled in 18.
Absolutely. So in 17 vintage, they like a lot of Bordeaux, they suffered from terrible frosts, and literally they did not produce a wine in 17. They didn't release anything on Primeur. And then in 18, there was a mildew attack, and they were hit badly by that because they're transitioning to organic viticulture. So they were extremely relieved to have a decent sized crop, which 9 vintage is. So that was the harvest anyway, and it was well worth doing.
And so in terms of this year, everything was cancelled after lockdown, so we had no trips to Bordeaux to taste the vintage, which is always one of the highlights of my year, that's for sure. Going away and tasting the new vintage. So it was a bit disappointing for me, but
well, I think disappointing for a lot of people, Shaun. Yes, normally I will do 2 trips again. Once for the official week, which is normally the first week of April, and in that week we get ferried around and visit maybe 15, 20 chateaus in a day, and you taste. I mean, you're only at a chateau for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. You're only tasting 1 or 2 wines, but it gives you a first impression of the harvest. And then I would normally go back 2 weeks later and taste at some of the smaller chateaus, because we do so many different wines. You can't get around everybody in 1 week. Problem this year, of course, is that I had 2 trips, and Shaun would normally join me in the second week. And the reason being that Shaun does all the forecasting for sales, so that I know how much to buy, and really for Shaun to get a good impression and a good feel for the vintage, it's really important for him to come out with me and taste the wines and talk to people and understand how the market is, whether chateaus are confident in the vintage, whether they are likely to put up their prices, all those kind of things. So we haven't been able to do that this year. So we had to, we had to react quite quickly and make provision for receiving samples. So what we did is we asked chateaus to actually send. Oh, there's a lot of noise going on. Sorry, outside my house. I hope that's not disturbing people. I live in South London, and there's some unce music going on outside. So apologies if that's putting you off. Certainly putting me.
I can't hear it, Tim. Anyway. So.
All right. Okay. So basically, we've had to get samples delivered. So what I did is I asked the chateaus normally via 1 or 2 negociants to send samples over, and because the Wine Society was effectively shut and there was nobody on reception, Shaun very kindly agreed to take in a huge number of samples that were coming over from Bordeaux, and then he delivered them into the Wine Society, and I tasted them in our tasting room. It's only one person allowed in the tasting room at one time due to social distancing. So then Shaun would taste after me, and then Sebastian Payne would taste after that. So the 3 of us actually tasted the wines. There you go. There's a picture from one of the, I think we did 2 big tastings. There you go. There's Sykes there, and Larivo, and a couple of others, some of which we
Come and
bought.
say, yeah, that's in our new tasting room.
That's in the new tasting room, exactly. So we did 2 sessions. What I wanted them to, because samples are so fragile, obviously the best way to taste samples is at the chateau, because you get the freshest possible samples. The problem with sending samples over and all around the world, so, you know, I live in London, so the samples had to come via Paris. But you can imagine if people are in China or in California or whatever, samples which are very fragile because they're tank samples have an awfully long journey. So the chances of them being out of condition are relatively high. So we were very reluctant to taste this way, but I asked the chateaux and the negociants to make sure that the samples were drawn from barrel on a Monday, that they were sent by courier on a Tuesday, so that they would arrive with Shaun on a Wednesday or a Thursday. And so he and I and Sebastian could taste on the Friday morning. So most of the samples actually did arrive in reasonable shape. I did have to get resamples from various people just because some of them were oxidized, and that's, you know, we were expecting that. But it did allow us to get a proper feel for the vintage. And I don't know if you agree, Shaun, but after a few tastings, it does all kind of fall into place.
No, absolutely, it does. It does. Yeah, but you need several tastings, don't you, to get sort of form the view of how the vintage is. And I think because the samples this year, they were a bit hit and miss. It was important to retaste and retaste, but then you got a real feel of the vintage itself.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, couldn't agree more.
In Bordeaux, you know, when I go for the official week, I might taste a particular wine 4 or 5 times, and it might taste slightly different each time because the samples are so fragile. So you can see why it's quite difficult to request samples and expect them to be showing at their best. But in addition to the 2 big tastings that we did in Stevenage, I was very fortunate to be invited by Lord Rothschild to taste both the Rothschild stables. So that's the Lafitte stables, which is Lafitte and Carrois de Lafitte and Duart-Milon. And also the Mouton stable. So that's Mouton Rothschild, Petit Mouton, d'Armaillac, and Clare-Milon. The Rothschilds had organized for a private plane to pick up samples in Bordeaux from the chateaus on the Monday. And I went up to Wadston Manor, their kind of country pile, to taste the wines on the Tuesday morning. So I think I was the first person to arrive, and therefore I was the first person to taste the samples, and they were in perfect condition. So I was, you know, we have already offered the top wines, the Lafitte and the Mouton, but we are offering at the moment Duart-Milon and d'Armaillac, both of which were excellent, and those are in our main offer, which has gone out now. And then the other wines that I tasted, I had to get sent to my home in London. So I did various tastings at home, including some al fresco tasting of Sauternes in the garden on a Sunday morning, because the samples arrived on the Saturday. So barefoot tasting in Clapham. And I have to say, we were able to form a view. We did taste a decent selection of wines. We've offered a slightly smaller selection this year than we would normally, but I am confident in the quality of the wines that we are offering. So I'm pleasantly surprised that that I have been able to form a view on the vintage and actually, with hand on heart, say that this is an excellent vintage and well worth buying. I think that's all that there is. What I should say, actually, there are certain chateaus that refused actually to send samples, and certain chateaus, particularly the top chateaus, have a policy of only allowing their wines to be tasted en primeur at the chateau, and that's because samples are very fragile. So there are certain wines that we've already offered in the first swathe of offers that we did for the top wines, and we'll come to that shortly. Some of the chateaux we offered having not tasted the wines, and that is, I think, the first time in Wine Society history. Is that right, Shaun? That we've never...
It is the first. Yeah, it's the first time we've ever offered wines which we haven't tasted. Yeah. Absolutely.
But we've done it because we have confidence in those chateaux. I think all the wines pretty much that we offered in the top range of expensive wines, we have offered every vintage for pretty much the last 10 or 15 years. Yeah. And also Jane Anson, who is the Bordeaux correspondent for Decanter magazine, who lives in Bordeaux, very kindly agreed to let us use her tasting notes. Jane tastes extremely well. She's extremely experienced. She's just brought out a book on Bordeaux, which is brilliant, actually, I have to say. So I'll give her a plug for her book. But there's no doubt that her tasting notes are every bit as valid as a Wine Society buyer's tasting notes. So we felt that we could offer the wines with complete confidence. In our offer that's just gone out now, the main offer, there is only one wine that I wasn't able to taste, which is the Segler 2019, the second wine from Rosan Segler. And you maybe didn't, for those people who've seen our offer, you may not have understood why my tasting note wasn't there and Jane's was. Well, that's the reason, because Rosan Segler and Canon, owned by the same family, the Wertheimer family, have a policy of only allowing you to taste their wines at the chateau. So,
is that a Wine Society exclusive, Tim?
It is a Wine Society exclusive, yes. We have up to 1,000 cases that we can sell. So I shall be buying quite a lot of 19s for stock, because the prices, as we'll come to later, are keen this year. But Segler, I think, is one of the best of the second wines, and I'm pleased that the Chateau has agreed to give us the exclusivity on Primeur for that wine.
It's selling very well, Tim, but there's still some available. So yes, it's selling very well, actually. Yeah.
Well, if we've got 1,000 cases, we're not going to sell out.
No, I might buy some of that.
So I guess we should talk about how we've offered the wines this year. I've talked about the drawbacks of not being able to go to Bordeaux. As I've alluded to, we have already offered the top 3 dozen wines. I think it was 36 wines. And that's, first growth, the super seconds, all those kind of wines. We've offered those already. Normally the prices start to come out after the official tasting week in Bordeaux. And normally it takes up to 12 weeks for the prices to be released. Each chateau decides when they want to release the wines. This year, it was incredibly concentrated. It was in less than 3 weeks. So those members who signed up to receive email offers for the top wines will have been inundated with 3 wines a day, 2-3 wines a day, sometimes 4 wines a day. Normally, we would have done those wines in what we used to call the pre-order offer, where we gave price banding and we printed an offer and sent it out to members. But we decided that it was such a complex way of offering the wines that we would do it differently this year. So we did individual offers online and posted the wines up on the web so people could order, and gave them 2 or 3 days to make a decision. And then we closed the offer. And from our perspective, although it was a flurry of emails to send out and it was quite stressful at the time, I think it was actually a very successful way of doing things. So we would really like to have feedback from the members who did buy that way, or any members if they have any views on that. But we did feel, and I discussed this with Shaun earlier, that the way we used to offer these wines, the pre-order offer, was actually too complex, and from our perspective, administratively very cumbersome, but also for members not easy to get your head round. Actually, it was a complex way to offer the wines. So we've already offered.
Yeah, when you don't know the price, it's tricky.
Yeah, the top 36 or so wines. We were able to, as soon as the wine came out, or certainly on the day that the price was released, we were able to offer the wine. And I do think that that's a good way of for future. But we would like to get some feedback from participants tonight, and we might canvass a broader cross section of opinions. So that's the top wines. Obviously, the reason we're having this webinar tonight is because our main offer has just gone up online. My hard copy, my printed copy, arrived today on my doormat, and those members who are expecting theirs, if you haven't got it, it will arrive imminently, or should arrive imminently. But we posted the wines online, I believe, last Friday, so we have some initial feedback, Shaun, and I believe the wines are selling well. Yeah.
They are selling extremely well, actually. Yeah, it's great to see such enthusiasm for all those wines, actually. And it's right across the board too. So I was just having a look at sales today, and yeah, the usual suspects like Beaumont, Syssac, Angleday, Segler, as I mentioned, Senejac, all those wines are selling fantastically. And the mixed cases are always the sort of temperature check for me, because I think we're one of the only merchants to offer mixed cases, and they're all selling well. So that's nice to see. Yes,
I mean, I think it's worth mentioning mixed cases, because I don't believe that anybody offers mixed cases, and it is a way, without breaking the bank, to actually try several wines, because depending on the mixed case that you buy, there might be one bottle of a dozen wines, or there might be 3 bottles of 4 wines, that kind of thing. And it does allow you to actually, without investing too much of your money, to try the en primeur mechanism, if you like, for buying wines up front and then waiting for them to be ready for drinking. So well worth checking out the mixed cases at the end of our offer.
Well, I think I've always bought a mixed case from the en primeur Bordeaux offers, because I think they're great value. And as you say, there's so much variety, and you just get to taste different things. So
I'm the same, Shaun. I buy the mixed cases as well, and I can't go right up the price spectrum, because a lot of the out of my limits, but mixed cases are a good way to get a cross section of wines. So you can see up on the screen, we're asking about the top wines. We're interested to know whether you would prefer to the prices to be delayed and then all the wines put into a printed offer, and with price banding. The other thing is, now for the main offer, Shaun, perhaps you can talk us through what we're basically doing a reassessment of how we offer wines en primeur. Perhaps you can explain what we are considering, and we will be asking questions.
So we've always done a printed offer. I think it's probably about 10 or 15 years ago now that we actually researched members and asked them if they were happy to receive the printed offer, or, as other merchants did, release the wines on a wine-by-wine basis digitally, which a lot of merchants were doing quite a long time ago. But we actually got feedback from members to say they preferred to get all the prices out on a printed offer, so that they could see exactly what all the chateaux were charging, in one place, and they could have it, on their sofas with a glass of claret and read through it. So that's what we've stuck to. But I'm really interested to know whether members still prefer that method, or whether they'd be happy to have a digital offer where we just put it online, or even if we released the wines as they came out and you ordered based on the price that was charged on the day. So if Chateau Beaumont came out 3 months ago, you actually ordered it there and then. So it'd be really interesting to see what members think.
Yes, I mean,
about how they'd like to digest the offer.
we do get a lot of feedback, or some feedback from certain members saying, why do you release the wines so late? You're much later than any other merchant. And just to explain, the reason we do that is A, because it takes time to print an offer, proof it, get it out in the right format. But it's also because you have to wait until the very last price comes out before you can go to print, if you want to have all the prices there. So I'm quite sure that, you know, you've said, Shaun, that members like to see the full offering and then be able to flick through it and decide what they like. But I'm sure there are other members who kind of think, well, I can buy this wine from X or Y merchant. I can get confirmation immediately that I've secured the wine. Why would I wait, you know, for a month or 6 weeks for the Wine Society offer to come out? So, you know, we want some feedback because we are open to changing the way we offer the wines. So please do feel free, either in this webinar or subsequently, to write to us or to email us to let us know your thoughts on this, because we want to canvass as many opinions as possible. One thing I would like to say, though, for this main offer, and we're going to come to in a minute to the style of the 19 vintage. I haven't forgotten about that. But for this offer, what I would like to say is that I have secured large stocks of all the wines pretty much that we're offering. There may be 1 or 2 wines where I don't know whether we've secured quite enough, but I would say pretty much all the wines we have got plenty of stock. What we have done in the last 2 years is actually early on in the campaign put a list of wines that we will be offering up on the website, so members know at least if the wine is not on the list, then you're going to need to buy it from another merchant if you particularly want a certain wine. But I do think it's important for us to let members know which wines we're going to be offering. And if we can, in future, I would like to be able to say to members, such and such a wine, we can get as much as we want. Such and such a wine, we can't get as much as we want. Because in the last few years, we've certainly managed to secure in our main offer almost everything that, you know, we've managed to satisfy member demand 100%.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
the top
anyway,
wines offer, it's more difficult, isn't it? That's why we often have to allocate. So
we are offering, and you need to react immediately. You know, the more modestly priced wines, it's rare that the Wine Society can't get enough wines, because you know, I buy the wines from probably certain wines I will buy from 5, 6, or 7 different negociants. So because we have good long-term relationships with the negociants, we can pretty much get what we want. So what I tend to do is I confirm a quantity based on Shaun's forecasts, and then I will take an option on extra wine, and I say to the negociants, we confirm X, and we will confirm an option of, say, you know, another 30, 40, 50 cases once our offer closes. So I know that a certain amount of wine has been set aside for the Wine Society. It's also worth mentioning that because 19 is such a great vintage and the prices are really interesting, I am going to be buying quite a lot of wine for the future. And the Wine Society, as many members will know, buys wine and sits on the wines until they're ready for drinking in big quantities. I think we're the only merchant that does that, Shaun.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think you're right.
Well,
actually,
certainly in any
Tim, moving.
We have millions of pounds worth of stock that we are sitting on and waiting until we think the wines are ready for drinking, and then we offer them at the market price. But it's a big undertaking and a big investment. But because we're a cooperative and we're not profit maximizing, and we have good cash flow, we are able to do that. So we will be. I intend. I had the green light from the from the chief executive of the Wine Society, Steve, to actually invest quite heavily in 19s.
What about the vintage, Tim? So
right, yes.
Probably
what most people who are participating tonight want to know. 2019. So let's talk about the reds first of all. It's an excellent vintage, and I have no qualms about saying that, even though I wasn't in Bordeaux to taste the wines. The wines have remarkable freshness. You have to understand it was a warm and dry vintage, a hot dry vintage. So it was a cold, cool spring, and it was actually very wet. But the advantage of the damp winter and early spring was that actually the water tables were replenished, and that had an important impact later on in the harvest. Spring was mixed. It wasn't the greatest spring. But then by the time July came along, the weather turned very hot and very dry. And what marks out the vintage is that despite the very dry, hot weather, because it was a damp and rainy winter, as I say, the water tables were replenished. So there wasn't too much vine stress during the hottest parts of the summer. And in late July, I gather the temperatures in certain parts of Bordeaux got up to over 40 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty hot. And there were, I think, 5 days over 35 degrees in July. So it really was very, very hot indeed. But those vineyards with mature vines, which had deep roots, and those vineyards on, particularly on kind of clay, water retentive soils, managed to keep the water, retain the water, and so the vines didn't suffer too much. I think some of the younger vines in the less water retentive soils did suffer as a result of the dry harvest. But overall, the style and character of the vintage for reds is it's vibrant fruit, plenty of volume to the wines, but the alcohol levels, if you look at our offer, you can see that the alcohol levels look quite high. But none of my tasting notes, when I looked back at my tasting notes, none of them said alcoholic or port-like or anything like that. And the reason for that is, although the levels of alcohol are relatively high, the balance is there. So the wines have good acidity and the pH levels are relatively low. So low pH means that the wines have freshness. And I have to say that, there are some wines in our offer that are likely to be 15%, but you don't taste that. So really some terrific wines that are balanced and vibrant and fresh. And I will be buying some for sure, particularly as the pricing is good. There are no particular communes, from what I can understand, that shine out. I think there are good wines and there are less good wines, but we've picked wines from pretty much every commune to go into our main offer. I'm a big fan of Saint-Estèphe because I think the wines offer very good value. And Saint-Estèphe, there were some lovely wines this year. So I would certainly, for members looking for value, I would certainly draw you towards Saint-Estèphe. Wines like Marquis de Calon, the second wine of Calon-Ségur, wines like Le Bosque, which is super this year, wines like Le Croc, also very good, owned by Léaville-Poifferet. Felon-Ségur is, sorry, say again.
Orme de Pez.
Orme de Pez is also super, owned by the Caz family. So Saint-Estèphe's good, but also lovely wines from Margaux and Saint-Julien and Pauillac. And also on the right back, I thought Pomerol was particularly good actually this year. Tasted some super wines. So things like La Pointe is lovely. Gazin, which is probably, I think, the most expensive wine that we're offering in our main offer. But Gazin is super this year. Saint-Emilion, we've got a smaller range this year, just because I didn't get to taste that many. But we may be buying some wines. When I visit Bordeaux, hopefully in September or October, I will retaste quite a lot of the wines, and we might be buying more wines for future sale. But the right bank is also good. So that's the reds, and then whites, super dry whites, really lovely. 18 vintage was warmer, and the wines have maybe a little less freshness, but 19, they are, that acidity that I mentioned for the red wines very much applies to the white wines as well. So the dry whites are super. I think we're only offering 4 or 5, but they're all absolutely top drawer, and I would certainly encourage members to maybe add half a dozen bottles to their baskets if they are ordering them, because Lagarde, which we don't often offer, but I think their white is getting better and better. Clos Floridène, which is a favorite every year, that's terrific. Le Bosque,
Busquet Blanc.
Busco, not Le Bosque. Busco is very, very good. La Tour Martillac, excellent, and also Domaine Chevalier, which is by many considered the top wine. And last but not least, Sauternes, a challenging vintage for Sauternes, because there was what's called acid rot this year, and whilst acid rot sounds awful, it is possible to eliminate grapes that suffer from acid rot. And I did extensive tastings of Sauternes in my garden and elsewhere, and I can say that I can say hand on heart that Sauternes did produce some lovely wines as well. I would like to make a shout out for Sauternes because Sauternes is an incredibly difficult place to make good wine. There are a huge amount of dedicated growers in Sauternes. It's a region that is suffering terribly because it's very difficult to make money in Sauternes. I think the Wine Society sells more Sauternes than virtually anybody in the UK. And we have a very loyal following for Sauternes. So if members are interested in 19s, we do a mixed case of half bottles. Is that right, Shaun?
Yeah.
Which is well worth considering. So that's the style of the wines. And last but not least, pricing. Well, the prices are down this year. For the first year, it's the first vintage for a while where the Bordelais have taken a pragmatic approach to pricing. It's the cheapest vintage often now, not for every chateau, but it's amongst the best value vintage available. The top wines came down between 20 and 30%. Most of the wines in this offer came down 5, 10, 15, 20%. So there are some bargains to be had. And I would strongly recommend the vintage, and I will certainly be buying some for myself. So I think maybe we should. I'm sure there are lots of questions, as you alluded to at the start, Tim. So maybe we should get on to those now.
Certainly, Tim. Thank you to both Tim and Shaun for that. A wonderful insight into the whole process. So thank you very much. But we do have a lot of questions. But I guess as we were just talking about Sauternes, one member thought that your tasting notes suggested that you weren't as enthusiastic about them this year. But what is it that makes a good vintage for Sauternes?
So obviously, plenty of botrytis or noble rot is important. And there is plenty of botrytis. It came on pretty late because the weather conditions that are conducive to making Sauternes are damp conditions. And it was a pretty dry harvest. So actually the best grapes for Sauternes were picked relatively late. They were well into October. But there were a few rain showers in Sauternes in October, and that helped as a catalyst to the Sauternes, to the botrytis production, the noble rot production. No, I think I'm sorry if I wasn't enthusiastic enough. I think the wines are very good. Sauternes has been blessed with a lot of good vintages recently, and in the great scheme of things, I would say it is a very good vintage. It's maybe not a 2001, but it's a very good vintage. And I think we can certainly say, buy with confidence. You won't be disappointed.
Great, thank you. Also, we've had some questions about new wines appearing on the list this year. What does it take for a new wine to be offered by the Wine Society?
So, I mean, we have the list, I have to say, doesn't change enormously from year to year, and that's because we've identified good chateaux that consistently make good wines year on year. Normally, when I go to Bordeaux for the official Primeur week, I will taste very extensively, and I will see, I will taste a lot of wines either that we haven't bought before or that we buy infrequently. I have to say this year I've been fairly conservative in that there aren't many wines in our main offer that we haven't offered fairly regularly. But I think it's an exceptional year in terms of not being able to retaste wines that frequently. So I've erred on the side of caution and tended to go for kind of benchmark chateaux that we buy regularly and that I know produce great wines year in, year out, in good vintages and in more challenging vintages.
Wonderful. So you mentioned there being conservative. Another area where we're often discussed as being conservative is with our drinking dates. So one question is, this year it appears that some are longer than previous vintages, but also some start earlier. Is that any comment on that? Is that global warming, climate change?
Well, good question. I mean, I pick the drink date. So every time I taste a wine, I put a drink date in, and then I cross-reference it with, what the drink dates that we have put on wines previously. I have to say, I go with, what's in front of me, what's in the glass, and when I think it'll be ready for drinking. And there are certainly some wines this year which are quite approachable and will be drinking relatively early, but it doesn't mean that they won't last. So just because a wine starts to drink early doesn't mean that it necessarily ends early as well. It just might mean that there's a broader window. Some vintages, the wines are quite tough and difficult to taste young, and the drink start date starts relatively late. Other vintages, the wines are relatively approachable young. It's horses for courses. It's not an easy subject to generalize on, because certain wines, I have to say, they surprise you. I mean, Shaun's got a 2005 Cantamel in front of him. When Sebastian, my predecessor, tasted the 05s, he raved about them, and quite rightly so. But the 05s, we've had to amend the drink dates on at least one occasion, haven't we, Shaun? Because they've actually taken longer to come round than anticipated.
And I think it's a bit like 2009, 2010. 2009 was very forward, very good vintage, but it drank beautifully early and then all the way through, and it lasted for a long time. 2010, I think, was more structured and more difficult to taste young, but actually I think it will last longer. In 2019, I found, when we were tasting them, Tim, that I found actually I quite like to drink this now.
Yes.
So I would say there were wines that had that cool freshness that was sort of easy to drink and very pleasant, but actually had the structure to last for quite a long time. So absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful. A couple of questions now on alcohol levels. One, how accurate are the predictions for alcohol, and do they tend to be higher or lower when wines finally come to bottle?
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead, Tim. Yeah, was there a second part of the question?
And then secondly, are we seeing a continued trend towards higher alcohols?
Yeah. So two good questions. So first of all, the alcohol levels that I have put into the offer, the great thing about Bordeaux is that there is a huge amount of information provided by the chateaux. So for me to give alcohol levels, pretty much every chateau has provided me with that information, and they give their best estimate. What you need to understand is that there is a tolerance labeling of wines from the EU. If your wine is 13.3%, no, let's say 14.3%, probably more appropriate for this vintage. If your wine is 14.3%, you have the choice of labeling it as 14 or 14.5. What you can't do is label it 14.3 because it has to be done in half degree increments. But you can be either just above or just below, but there is a half degree tolerance. I would say that some of the chateaus give you a precise alcoholic degree, so it might be 14.26. So you don't quite know whether they will label it 14.5 or 14. But I would say that pretty much every wine that we have put in, we've put in alcohol levels for all of them, they will be correct within half a degree, but I can't call whether they will up it or lower it to the half degree. And to answer the second part of the question, yes, alcohol levels are increasing. It is a fact. And when I was head of buying, I got more questions about alcohol levels probably from members than any other subject. And the reason for this is partly due to climate change, but it's also due to vineyard practices. And I did a piece online a few weeks ago about the effects of climate change in Bordeaux. And there are certain vineyard practices that you can implement which help to reduce alcohol levels. And I think chateaus are more and more cognizant of the increase in alcohol, and they are making strides to try and decrease or to moderate the levels of alcohol in their wine. But there's no doubt that the days of 12.5% clarets from the left bank are numbered, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it depends on your tastes. But just to come back to the question of balance is the key here. And as long as the wine is balanced, even if the alcohol level looks to be excessive, as long as it's balanced, then I'm happy with it. And I don't tend to buy wines at 15% alcohol, but some of my favorite wines today, I mentioned Marquis de Calon a moment ago. That wine is 15%, but it was one of my picks for Santa Steph, and I would never have said I raised an eyebrow when I saw that the alcohol on that wine was 15%. I wouldn't have put it more than 14 at the very most. So, balance plays an important part in this.
Great, thank you. You mentioned there some of your favourites there, so we've had a few questions come through to that effect. One in particular said, I brought class growths on Primeur, but have been particularly pleased with cases of some of the so-called lower wines from previous offers.
Yeah.
Could you give us an insight into some equivalent or some favourite wines from this year's selection?
Yes, well, certainly at the lower end. I mean, there's some terrific Haut Médocs this year. I think Haut Médoc, although it's a modest appellation, there are some super wines, and also some of the satellite areas like Moulis. So Dutrouche Grand Peugeot this year is lovely. That's been a member favourite for many, many years. Sissac, you can see on the picture in front of you, Sissac is lovely this year. Sénéjac, that Shaun mentioned earlier, lovely this year as well. Beaumont, which is the best-selling wine that we offer on Primeur, also terrific this year. So the Lannessan as well. So plenty of good, relatively modest priced wines. And a few years of bottle age on those wines are well worth the patience, because what you get at the end of it is absolutely super. The other thing I would mention at the more modest end of the spectrum, and it's not, it's probably one step up from the Haut Médocs, are the second wines. And I'm buying more and more second wines for the Wine Society, because I believe in them and I think that they do offer terrific value. So Lacoste Bory, which I'm enjoying at the moment in 15 vintage, that's a wine that I buy pretty much every year, and I think it offers terrific value. Segler, the second wine of Rosan Segler. Brand Cantonac's second wine, Baron de Brand, is terrific this year. Marquis de Calon, which I've mentioned, the second wine of Calon Ségur, terrific. Going up the spectrum, yeah, I mean, things like Branagh du Cru, things like Giscourt are lovely this year. Prices are well down on those two wines, terrific wines. On the right bank, La Pointe that I mentioned earlier, very, very good indeed. No, there are some terrific wines across the board, but you know, hand on heart, anything in the offer, I stand by my selection and would be happy to have in my cellar. And then for the whites, yeah, I mean, all the whites, we've only offered 5 whites, I think it is, and all of those are well worth buying. And the same for Sauternes. I did taste a lot of Sauternes, and I think we've offered half a dozen Sauternes, all of which are top drawer.
Wonderful, thanks for that insight.
Shaun, do you want to add any? Shaun, you had a few favourites, I'm sure.
Well, as you say, Tim, Beaumont I thought was lovely this year. Actually, I just think it gets better and better and just offers fantastic value. So Domaine de l'Église was one that I don't think you've mentioned yet, which I thought stood out for me.
Yes, that's a good point.
Which we don't always sell, but that was a real favourite of mine, and I was surprised by that. It was very good.
Owned by the same people as Bataille and Trocvier. Yeah.
And the wine that stood out for me, and I think I mentioned it at the time because I tasted those at home, was Baron de Bran. And Brown Cantonac was in the top wines offer, and I thought that was absolutely stunning. But the Baron de Bran, which is the second wine of Brown Cantonac, was absolutely fantastic, and that's probably one that I'm going to try and afford this year because it was stunning. So excellent.
Yeah,
lovely. Thanks, guys. Possibly another question for Shaun. One, what is the position regarding import duty on Primeur wines coming into the UK after the potential hard no deal Brexit? That's
a really, really hard question, and one we don't know the answer to, and I think we wish we did. But no, I honestly, I wouldn't even want to guess at the answer of that. I don't know is the answer, but we'll have to allow for that. Obviously, the wines will come in a couple of years' time, and we just but I don't know what the answer is to that. I'm afraid, Tim. I wouldn't even want to hazard a guess.
No,
sorry, Tim. I don't know whether you want to.
No, I got an email this week from Simon Mason, my colleague, who sits on one of the committees for the Wine and Spirit Trades Association, with some of the Brexit challenges associated with the transitional period. We are lobbying hard for clarity on this, so I'm hoping that between now and the end of the year, we'll be able to give members more information on this. But at the moment, it's all chaotic, as the entire process of Brexit has been from the start.
Expected that answer, but thought it'd have to be asked anyway.
Sorry. Yeah.
So we are running out of time. So perhaps just one final question, then I'll perhaps hand over for some final thoughts. But Craig Colton has said that it seems to me that every year is a great year when it is launched. How do we actually determine the truth behind the various vintages?
Good question. So, I mean, I think we try to be as honest as we can at the Wine Society. Because we're not driven by profit, I hope that members trust what we say. One thing to understand is that we don't rely on our Primeur to survive. Our Primeur is the icing on the cake, if you like. So we feel that we can be honest in our opinions of the vintage, but there is no doubt that there are fewer and fewer bum vintages these days, and that's because the weather is certainly, with global warming or climate change, whichever way you want to put it, grapes tend to ripen more readily. But secondly, vineyard practices and winery practices are much more advanced than they were 20 years ago, and vintages are much more consistent. So, there's never been a better time to be buying Bordeaux, that's for sure, because the quality is terrific. I was having a conversation with somebody on Tuesday. First growths 20 years ago, there are a lot of class growths now, from recent vintages that are every bit as good as first growths were 20 years ago. So yes, the prices have gone up, but I think a lot of chateaus are producing wines that are every bit as good as the really top wines were 20, 30 years ago.
Wonderful. So yeah, I guess any final comments then just on the 19 and that you'd like to leave members with?
Well, I've said it a couple of times, but I will be buying 19. The pricing is keen. The vintage is great. It's a more classic vintage maybe than 18 in terms of it's less ripe maybe in its profile, but it's a vintage that will give a huge amount of pleasure, red, white, and sweet. And as I said a moment ago, I can certainly put my hand on my heart and feel confident that all the wines that we're offering have a place in the offer and are worth buying. I don't know, Shaun, if you have any final comments.
No, I think I just echo what you say, Tim. But I'm comparative novice compared to you in terms of tasting. But I did find lots of pleasure, which is what I always look for, is sort of that easy drinking and that freshness and the balance as well, which I did find in the wines this year when I tasted them. So they will give enormous amounts of pleasure. And I think what's nice is they'll drink, as I've said before, relatively early, but all the way through, and they'll keep, which is, so they've got the structure as well as that lovely sweet freshness that we look for. So it's a very pleasurable vintage, and you've got the added bonus of it being excellent value. The prices have come down, so what's not to like there. So
yeah.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, can I just thank you both very much for your time this evening, particularly Shaun coming in from your holidays. Hope that members appreciated your insights into this year's offer, and hopefully they can use that when making their decisions whether to purchase or not, or what wines to put or not. I would encourage people to go to our YouTube channel to view Tim's video that he did earlier. I think it was last month, where he addressed climate change in Bordeaux and the introduction of new grape varieties, for further insight into that area, because we do get a lot of questions on global warming and climate change. And I'd also direct people to the community, the Society's web forum, where the current thread on Bordeaux 2019 has over 750 posts. So if you do want to catch up on some of that, you can read through what other members are thinking about the current lay of the land, as it were, with the Bordeaux campaign. So thank you to everyone for joining. We've had about 200 members online tonight, so a very good turnout. And I hope you'll be joining us next week when we've got Ridge from California and a special En Primeur Port event. So lots more to look forward to from the virtual tastings.
Thanks,
Tim. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your holiday, Shaun.
Cheers, Tim. I will.